In this talk I'm going to be looking at what a mode of production is in Marx's theory. The fundamental thesis of Marxism is that in the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations, independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to the given stage of the development of the material forces of the production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arise a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political and intellectual life. This is in 1857, before Marx wrote Capital. Here he's talking about the mode of production of material life. Emphasis on material here. If you then go on much later, and here I'm taking Stalin as an example, but you could get much the same formulation in the Althusserian school and many post-1960 Western Marxists. Stalin says the productive forces are only one aspect of production, only one aspect of the mode of production, an aspect that expresses the relation of men to the objects and forces of nature which they make use of for the production of material values. Another aspect of production, another aspect of the mode of production, is the relation of men to each other in the process of production and men's relations of production. This seems pretty similar, but it's not quite the same. Here he's saying that the mode of production is productive forces plus production relations. That becomes even more explicit in the Althusserian school. Is this the same as Marx? No, I think it's an oversimplification. And the important oversimplification is that in many places, and I think in the predominant way he uses it, when Marx talks about the mode of production, he's talking about the mode of material production. And this has a lot of relevance to the debates which occur about whether or not the USSR had a socialist mode of production, for example. Because you have to ask, what would a socialist mode of production actually be? Does it make any sense to talk of a socialist mode of production? The first use of the term mode of production in Capital is the following. The mode of production in which the product takes the form of a commodity or is produced directly for exchange is the most general and embryonic form of bourgeois production. It therefore makes its appearance at an early date in history, though not in the same predominating and characteristic manner as nowadays. Here he's just using the term mode of production to simply mean any system of commodity production dating to early in history. And he's not making any reference to the mode of material production here. But later on it shifts. Another passage says, the reader will bear in mind that the production of surplus value, or the extraction of surplus labour, is the specific end and aim, the sum and substance of capitalist production, quite apart from any changes in the mode of production, which may arise from the subordination of labour to capital. Here he distinguishes between capitalist production and the mode of production. The mode of production now refers to the actual labour process. The mode of production is something distinct from the extraction of surplus value, and the mode of production is changed as a result of capitalist production. So capitalist production comes first and later creates the capitalist mode of production, which implies that you can have capitalism without a capitalist mode of production. The capitalist mode of production is a later historical phase. At first, capital subordinates labour on the basis of the technical conditions in which it historically finds it. It does not therefore immediately change the mode of production. So here he is saying that the subordination of labour to capital is not equivalent to the capitalist mode of production. People think the capitalist mode of production is the same as the exploitation of wage labour. Marx says the exploitation of wage labour precedes the capitalist mode of production. So what then is the capitalist mode of production? The capitalist mode of production is machine industry. The passion of capital for an unlimited and reckless extension of the working day is first gratified in the industries earliest revolutionized by water power, steam and machinery. In those first creations of the modern mode of production, cotton, wool, flax and silk spinning and weaving, the changes in the material mode of production and the corresponding changes in the social relations of the producers give first to an extravagance beyond all bounds. So he's quite explicit here that the modern mode of production is what we know as the factory system, powered factory machinery. This is what is the change in the material mode of production that is associated with capitalism, that comes as a consequence of capitalism and creates the capitalist mode of production. Capitalist mode of production is the factory system, the system of powered machinery carrying out production supervised by workers. The point to emphasize is that capital actually revolutionises the mode of production. Marx says that hitherto, in treating of surplus value arising from a simple prolongation of the working day, we have assumed that the mode of production is given and invariable. But when surplus value has to be produced by the conversion of necessary labour into surplus labour, it no longer suffices for capital to take over the labour process in the form under which it has been historically handed down, and then simply prolong the duration. The technical and social conditions of the process, and consequently the very mode of production, must be revolutionised. Therefore the productiveness of labour can be increased. So here he clearly means by the very mode of production the actual mode of material production. So there's a sequence of uses of the phrase. First, production of commodities, then extraction of surplus value, then he talks about manufacturing and the division of labour, and then he talks about machine industry, which is the specifically capitalist mode of production. But this then raises a problem. What's a socialist mode of production? If machine industry is a specifically capitalist mode of production, what is the socialist mode? Doesn't socialism base itself on machine industry too? So is machine industry the mode of production of both capitalism and socialism? Now, one possible way of looking at it, and still arriving at the idea that there's something unique about socialism in terms of the mode of production, is the emphasis that the communists have placed on electrification. Lenin famously said that communism was Soviet power plus electrification. Capitalism went from water to wind power to steam, but communists from the beginning have been in favour of using electricity. In the 1890s, Liebknecht wrote about having met Marx in the 1850s, just after Marx had seen a model electric train. Marx enthused that just as steam had created capitalism, electric power would create a new economic and social order. It's probable that the electric train he saw was an early Siemens demonstration train, of which I have a photo here. It wasn't yet practical for industrial use, but it demonstrated that electrical vehicles were possible. There's a sequence of sources of power used by modes of production. Slavery used muscle power. Feudalism used muscle power, but also a lot of water power. There were literally thousands of water mills recorded in the Doomsday Book in 1086 in Britain. Thousands of them, around 3,000. The innovation of industrial capitalism was the use of steam power. Water power was already well established in the feudal economy. And Marx thought that electrical power would bring about or be associated with socialism. So we have to ask, why electricity? Liebknecht was very sceptical about Marx statements about electricity. Writing in the 1890s, he said, "What use has electricity been to us, basically? It's had no impact on the economy." Now, Marx was obviously right. Electricity has had a huge impact, been very widely used. But we have to say, why was electricity seen as so crucial that Lenin singled it out as the very key to Soviet industrialization? Why is it so important? Let's look at the different forms of power, starting with muscle power. Human power is an universal, abstract, productive capacity. This is what is meant by abstract labour. We can apply our skills to any productive activity and use our muscles to that purpose. Our energy output is modest. It's perhaps 100 watts, but it can be applied in any trade or profession. The first alternative to human effort was that of our brute servants, the ox and the horse. Strong as these companions are, their skills are limited. They helped us draw vehicles or pull ploughs, but they couldn't help us crew ships, lay bricks, or to spin. Next came steam. Steam went to sea with us, supplanting half a crew, replaced our beasts in traction, turned mills, cut stones for our cities, but she was heavy, inflexible, and produced only motive force. She could not sing, wash, or see for us. With electricity, we harnessed for the first time a power that rivaled that of human labour in flexibility, whilst vastly surpassing it in magnitude. Electricity wrote for us, then spoke for us, then saw for us, in telegraphs, telephones, and television. Its motors range in size and power from our little fingers to that of 50,000 horses. It lights our darkness, heats our homes, stores our records, reasons and calculates. It is power in the abstract, the general what. Electricity requires the establishment of national electricity grids. This in turn requires planning. It also requires an effective monopoly, since you can't have two different systems of delivering power to each house. This in turn implies either state-regulated capitalism or public ownership of electricity supply. I think this is another reason for Lenin's enthusiasm. He saw it as an inherently socialist form of the distribution of energy, which could only, by some distortion, become a capitalist one. He saw planned electric power as the basis of socialism, and even if you look in the 1960s program of the CPSU, written by Khrushchev, again they lay great emphasis on electric power as the foundation of communism. Now, any mode of production has to tap into energy sources, and the successive modes of material production have tapped into greater energy resources. Consider the first big transition, the transition from a hunter-gatherer society to an agricultural society. Now, this involves a shift of trophic levels in the ecological network. The concept of a trophic level is that level 1 is plants, level 2 is herbivores, and level 3 is carnivores. And in any ecosystem, you have these levels. And as you move up the levels, less and less energy is available, so that 10 times as much energy is available directly in the form of plants as there is in the form of as is available to herbivores, and then that is cut down by a factor 10 again when you look at the carnivores. So each of these successive layers represents less biomass and a smaller energy flux. Now, on the right hand side here I show wolves, deer, trees. Left hand side, corn, goats, humans. As humans move down the trophic level, moving from hunting to herding to agriculture, the energy flux available to them increased, probably a couple of orders of magnitude. Now, if we look at the specifically capitalist mode of production, which is machine industry, this is the form which produces relative surplus value. That is to say, surplus value produced by reducing the labour time required to produce the real wage. If less time is required to produce the real wage, a larger part of the working day is surplus. This is what Marx called the real, not formal, subordination of labour to capital. The real subordination of labour to capital comes about through the use of machinery. A formal subordination of labour to capital existed prior to the use of machinery, when workers merely lacked the raw materials and were exploited under something like the putting out system. But this reduction in labour input was only possible by tapping non-biological energy sources. The specifically capitalist mode of production depended initially on water, then coal, then oil. So you cannot separate out energy sources from the mode of production. And when you look at the evolution of modes of production over time, you have to look at the time span in which something is going to be viable. The hitherto existing industrial mode of production, and variants of that have been seen in both historical capitalism and socialism, depends on sunlight that has been sequestered in fossil form. Now, any mode of production like that is self-limiting, destroying its own conditions of existence. And this limitation of the mode of production is, in a sense, at a lower level than the limitation caused by the falling rate of profit. It depends on resources which, by the scale of human history, will be quickly exhausted. And it is this that marks out the mode of production as ultimately transitory. Now, this is not to say that forms of machine production, machine-based production, or artificial energy-based production aren't possible in the future. But they're not going to be ones based on fossil fuel. They're going to use either nuclear fission, solar fuel, or nuclear fusion. And if we look at all of these new forms of energy, these new energy sources, well, historically relatively new energy sources, you see all of them have depended on the state, in some cases explicitly on socialist states, for their development. In both the West and the East, nuclear power was initially a state enterprise, a state project. We can see how the privatization of electricity supply in Britain resulted in a situation where Britain is no longer able to produce its own nuclear reactors. 20 or 30 years after privatization, what does the state have to do when it decides that for strategic reasons it does need nuclear power? It has to turn to two countries which still have state electricity to supply them, France and China. So the British Conservative government ends up dependent on the People's Republic of China to build its nuclear reactors. When we look at solar power, the rapid development of solar power came first through the German government intervening to encourage it, but then much more significantly due to the policies of the Chinese government of differentiating its power supply and having a planned shift towards the introduction of solar power, so that they're now building solar power plant at the order of 50 gigawatts capacity each year. And it is the conscious plan to drive down through mass production the cost of solar power that is having a worldwide impact and making the cost of solar power become competitive with coal fire. And this is a result of conscious planning by the Chinese state. If we look at the longer term source of nuclear power, it's nuclear fusion. And that relies on the tokamak design, originally invented by Sakharov back in the 50s, and which has basically taken a 70-year development period from the first prototypes to the point where a power reactor is likely to be put into action. And that power reactor, the ITER reactor in France, came as one of the last international initiatives of the USSR to create an international consortium to build the tokamak power reactor. The world is now entering the terminal crisis of the mode of production based on fossil-fueled machine production. The whole geopolitical system of today's world rests on this mode of material production. From it stems the ever-growing rivalry to control the world's remaining oil reserves. The hegemonic power, the USA, has social relations which are preventing it replacing fossil fuel as its base. The second main economy, China, because it has a mixed capitalist and socialist ownership, potentially can transcend fossil fuel production and move to a non-fossil fuel base. And this is setting the stage for the great conflict between modes of production in the coming period.